Hey everybody, Ben here from Cinderblock Studios, and today I'm back finally with another acrylic painting tutorial. Today we're painting a palm tree. So as some of you may already recall, I actually already have a tutorial on painting a palm tree. You can check it out over here. But I'm updating it for two reasons. First, this version will be in HD. The old one is not. Second, in the old one, I only really painted the silhouette of a palm tree. I didn't actually show you guys how to paint the rest of it. So that is what we're doing today. Okay, so for today's tutorial, we're going to be working on a piece of canvas that is sort of custom stretched on a couple of pieces of cardboard. This is going to sort of mimic the kind of look and feel of what you might get out of a canvas board. As you also can probably tell, there's a little bit of a sort of tinted section here that is just a little bit of like brown paint water mixed with some thin layer of molding paste, just to kind of give us an extra area of grounding for the piece itself. As always, I have my glass palettes off to the side. I'm displaying both of them together this time rather than doing the small corner video. I think it's just going to make it a little bit easier to show both for this particular tutorial. You're also going to want a little bit of water. For my water, I'm just using a small jar today. I don't need my big bucket because the only two brushes we're really going to be using are a regular liner brush. I recommend something relatively small and thin. It doesn't necessarily have to be a liner or a script brush, but these certainly make the entire process a lot easier. You can use just a small round, but having that extra bit of length on the bristles, as you'll see later, are really going to help out. You're also going to want either a flat or a round brush. I'm going to recommend a small flat. Again, you'll see why later, but again, you can do it with really kind of any shape. For our paint, I've actually got this brown mix that I made yesterday for another project. This is basically just some, I think, cobalt blue, cerulean blue, and some red oxide, but you can use an out of the tube umber or sienna if you so desire. You're also going to want a yellow. I've got some CAD yellow medium pure. I have a little bit of sap green hue, which I'm going to squeeze out. I don't need a ton. I'm just going to be tinting it back and forth with the yellow and my blue, which is some cobalt blue pure. Now I want to make note that you don't necessarily have to use the exact same colors I'm using. I'm simply shouting them out just to kind of give you an understanding of how my colors are going to mix. Your colors, if you're using something like an ultramarine or a phthalo, going to mix a little bit differently. If your yellow is something like a Hansa yellow or a dialoride yellow, again, it's going to mix a little bit differently. So palm trees are actually a very simple design. And now when I talk about a palm tree, there's a lot of different kinds of palm trees. So when I think about a palm tree, I'm thinking of sort of a classic, what I call a Florida palm tree. Big kind of branchy out areas, big tall, long trunk, and then just sort of the stuff at the top that kind of branches out, something like this here. So that's basically the kind of tree we're going to be making today, and it's a very, very simple technique, and I hope you enjoy it. So for this, I'm actually just going to start out just kind of sketch a little bit on the canvas, give myself a bit of baseland, and then I just want to do a simple trunk shape and then just an outline. So for this, I'm going to go with just a line for the trunk, and it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. In fact, it's better if it's slightly curved. So really the wavier and messier the line for the trunk is, actually ends up working in your favor. So don't worry about getting a perfect curve. And then from here, I do usually 4 or 5 just kind of areas out like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is sort of already just sort of that basic palm tree shape. You can set your pencil aside or whatever you happen to be sketching with. And we're just going to start out sort of by building a base to this. So dip a little water, wet your bristles. And again, you don't necessarily have to use brown for your base. I'm just using it sort of as a dark color to start. And so from here, I like doing, need a little more water here. Just smooth out the paint. To kind of get the barrel trunk, I like to do just the brush stroke itself and just kind of come across. like so. And then you can take the edge of your brush and kind of clean those edges up. Like so. Now again, I want to get a little bit of a base for these branches, so we're just going to kind of come on. I'm using my pinky finger to kind of balance, because my hands are a little shaky, as you can probably see. Just kind of getting that arc for the branches. I'm like, oh, I'm going to extend them out a little bit from where the sketch was, because based on how thick I made this, I'm actually going to have to do that. Yeah, this is bugging me. This is too thick, considerably. This should have been a lot thinner. But you'll know that for next time. So actually, I'm gonna come over here and just. Yeah, that's how thin you kind of should be working for your trunk. And then of course, things that kind of branch out like that. Yeah, that's how thin you kind of should be looking, but we'll let this go for now. Like so. And there's our simple brown base. Now, take your liner, and you're going to load up that paint. If you've got a soft body or a liquid, this technique is actually a little bit easier, so that way you don't have to actually thin out the heavy body. Okay, so this is the real sort of you could say secret to making palm trees, and all you're really doing is just making quick, simple little small lines. So we're gonna go from the top down if we can. That way we're not getting paint all over our hands. So we're just gonna take and work from the back to the tip, and just little grassy kind of motions. Like that. And you usually want them to be longer and fatter towards the back, and as we get to the tip, it'll go a little thinner and a little shorter, at least of the branch itself. So we're going to pull these out quite a lot. I'm kind of just, for the most part, following the shape of the branch. I'm actually picking up a good bit of texture off of this canvas. A lot of times the palm trees you have in your paintings are going to be like the top layer, basically. So you wouldn't pick up quite as much texture on the canvas as I am here. Now there's a lot of areas here, especially towards the edge, where you can really kind of see that initial line of the branch. So what I like to do is actually kind of cover that up a little bit, just at the base, just to kind of hide that initial line so you can't really see it. Okay, now when we get to this kind of corner, I do like to kind of arc it out a bit more. You want to make sure that that your branches are kind of spreading out to kind of cover up this center area, because this whole area in the center is kind of a big imperfection. I'm sure there's a better way of doing it, but this is sort of the way that I kind of taught myself how to do it, and I find that it's actually really effective to do it this way as well. Because once you go in with your shadows and highlights later, then it becomes a little easier to manage. Right about like that. Just get a little bit more here. Now I'm going to go ahead and throw the rest of these, at least with the darks, into time-lapse, but I'll make sure not to speed it up too much so you can actually still see what I'm doing. So I'll be back in just a little bit. Okay, so I'm just finishing up this last branch, and one thing I wanted to mention that I actually kind of forgot about even as working is up in here you see a couple of spots that are a lot thicker, a lot more of a glob, and that is because I was trying to push with the brush rather than trying to pull with it. Granted, there's a difference, though. I couldn't turn the whole canvas because I'm doing this tutorial. Normally I just turn the canvas, but I couldn't. In order to get these sort of nice, simple hairline shapes, make sure you're pulling with the brush and not pushing to get that. As you're pulling, that tapered line at the edge happens when you kind of pull up and lift. And that's really how you'd be getting this simple technique to work more effectively. Okay, so I'm just going to clean up a couple of things here. And then we're going to go ahead and just move in to the next step. Now I should note that this is sort of where the old tutorial left off, because I kind of just did that silhouette and it was like, okay, that's it, that's all we're doing. You kind of were left like, okay, that might be nice for a sunset, either like a dark brown like this or a black over top of a really kind of solid sunset. This would look great. But the problem is not every landscape is going to have palm trees at sunset. It's nice to have some during the day sometimes. So how do you highlight this? How do you bring some color into this to make it seem more than just a simple silhouette shape? So for this, I'm just going to start with some green and a little bit of our blue to just kind of darken it. And all we're going to do is build up a couple different layers of color on top of this. So the same technique that we were doing before here, simple pulling out and up to make those little branchy areas. Start kind of in the center. And don't worry about going over every single line. Leave a few that are darker, leave a few that are, and make a few that are lighter. It's okay to have that little bit of variance in your leaf, because it honestly tends to make it a lot more interesting. It makes it seem like you have a lot more layers than you actually do. It gives a lot more depth to the piece itself. So I'm going over some of it, some of the greens going right into the lighter color on the canvas, so you're seeing that brighten up a lot faster. And I'm going to kind of imagine that my light's kind of coming down from the top. So as we get to a lighter color, you'll see that a bit more. But this level of green, if you're looking for something that isn't quite as strong of a sunset, maybe it's still more of a sort of a dusk, and you got a lot more light in your landscape. It's not just all silhouette. This single layer of green is sort of right where you'd stop at that point, because then you'd add that little green, and then that way you'd kind of it would show just a little bit of light in the branches, but not a ton. Because you generally, if you're doing sort of that late evening, just before the sun really starts to hit the horizon, and things are just starting to get dark, that's kind of the point where you'd stop for this, just to kind of give you that extra bit of highlight, to know that it's not a silhouette, and it's just that point in the day where there's more shadows than light, but not enough light to really kind of reflect out. So as before, I'm going to go ahead and put this into time-lapse and finish this up, and I'll be back with the next layer. Okay, so next up we have sort of our first big area of highlights. So we're going to get our yellow and mix that in with our green to kind of really brighten that up. A little more blue in that. And if you've ever seen palm trees up close, or if you haven't, there's sort of a ridge. The palm branches don't just kind of spray out from the center, kind of as the silhouette shows, but they kind of have a ridge on the top which sort of is what that initial line was for us, that initial arc that we made at the very beginning with pencil and then with the darker brown. So we want to start by kind of establishing where you kind of want that ridge to be, and then working your highlights out from there. And you may not see that ridge everywhere, but you're definitely going to see it specifically on the branches that kind of curve down in front of the viewer. So there's one there. There's one there. This one you may not see a lot of. One there. One here. And one here. And that's just a really subtle base, just to kind of give yourself an idea of where those are. So I'm just going to make this just a little bit brighter. It's just so it shows up a little better on camera. Thin that out. And just as before, throw in some highlights. But at this point, you want to be a little bit more conscious of where your light's coming from, as well as not overdoing it, because you could very easily overdo it. If you notice, I put a lot of the dark down, not as much of the dark green, and then there's probably going to be half of that is going to be the stuff that really kind of picks up the light. So we're going to get more on the top. Still a few on the bottom. Now right in the center, this is an interesting point because this is where all the branches are kind of converging. So you kind of make decisions about where you want those highlights to be to kind of cover up that center to some degree. I'll put a little bit more on this top section because I want this branch on the right to kind of be on top of the other ones. And as you can see, I'm really not going overboard. I'm just adding a couple in to give that extra little indication of where those branches are kind of meeting. You could very easily just overpower this with the light green, and it just would make it really unfortunate. Kind of arcing a few of these out and down a little bit. Put a little more in here. Cover up that center point. And then the top one. This one's probably the closest to the light, so we're going to have a few more here. Just like we had a few more on this side, towards the top. Again, very, very lightly touching the canvas. We're not really pushing down here. As you've seen throughout the course of this, I'm just kind of grazing the tip of this brush across the canvas. Right about like that. Now we've got a pretty handsome palm tree right here. Now one thing you can do at this point, and I will a little bit later, but you can push your darks and your lights of these branches a little bit further in either direction now. You can add a second layer of highlights with a little bit of white into your yellow-green mix, or actually one color I do recommend for highlighting foliage, some titanium buff, since it does lean a little bit more yellow. And then you could go in with a blue or even like a deep violet and really kind of highlight out, or rather highlight with dark, so to speak, and really define a few more shadows within that. And I'll do that a little bit later, but I want to finish up this trunk first, because this trunk, of course, not highlighted, so we have to do something about that. We're going to take some of our brown mixture and add our yellow to that and brighten that up. Actually, at this point, I think I will need some white. Totally forgot about white, specifically for the trunk, but we're going to start with this. And so again, our highlight's coming sort of from the top. So this is actually going to split our highlight a little bit, albeit a little bit on the right and then a little bit more down on the left. So for this, I'm actually going to basically do a simple dry brush technique, and you can check out a tutorial for dry brushing up in the corner here. Basically, you load up your brush with paint, and then you wipe some of it away, and just kind of have the little bit of damp bristles, damp with paint, not damp with water. And so from there, you just kind of as we did before, a little section at a time, and pull. Yeah, this isn't going to show up real well, so I'm definitely going to have to grab a little white. Yeah, and then we get to on this side just a hair. Kind of darker in the center. And it'll also be a lot darker up where all these branches meet, so I'm not even going to touch that really. Like so. Okay, so now we're going to get a little bit of our white. Again, here I'm using titanium buff. I find it's a good alternative white, specifically for doing a lot of foliage and naturalistic landscape elements. So with this color, just as we did with the yellow, pull a little bit at a time. And I'm kind of arcing my brush stroke a little bit to mimic the fact that it's a round tree trunk. Let's get some of that. It's more pure. Right about like that. Now, as far as this tutorial goes as a whole, we can call this done. But I do want to go back in and add just a couple of those extra, more extreme highlights and shadows, just to kind of show you what I was talking about. So if you want to stop watching here, feel free. This would definitely be considered a finished palm tree, at least to some degree. Looking sort of towards this now, actually I almost wish I would have had another branch of leaves kind of coming up this way, and maybe even another one here, but don't want to go overboard on this. It's just a nice simple demo. So for my two extremes here, I'm going to grab some of that pure titanium buff and kind of just clean this up a little bit more. I'm very sparingly using these. That's pretty good. I don't want to hide any of that deep edge that was there. Now with this color, we're going to mix a little yellow into that. And then use that as a secondary highlight to the branches. Tiny bit of green in there, not a lot. That way we can just take a couple extra areas and make them stand out a little bit more. A couple extra branches. Like this one on the right in particular that I specifically said that I wanted to make it seem like it's on top. That extra highlight will really help you do that. Here. Here. So there's that extra highlight. Really makes that stand out. I'm going to go green and blue, but probably leaning more blue. Just add a couple extra darks. Now if I was doing this on a larger painting of my own that wasn't this demo, I might have thrown some black into this just to really darken that color up. You can just do it with your green and your blue, it's not a big deal. I like to tell people not to use black, specifically because it can really quickly overpower a piece, but when I'm painting personally, I like to add a little extra contrast in. And we're actually going to add a little bit of this, again, a little more blue heavy, right to the trunk of the tree. As just an extra bit of shadow. Like so. So, that is really a nice, simple, relatively easy method for painting a palm tree. Now, as for the rest of your landscape elements, feel free to visit the channel page and just search Acrylic Painting Tutorial. Also, be sure to check out the Beginner's Tutorial playlist for how to paint a lot more stuff like this, including simple, easy blue sky methods, all sorts of other trees, rocks, mountains, and the like. So, for more like this, be sure to subscribe to the Cinnamon Studios channel here on YouTube, and this is Ben. See you guys next time.